This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. Today, we're exploring one of the most dangerous dynamics in armed conflict, the escalation trap. This is the phenomenon where opposing sides, each responding to what they perceive as provocations, drive a conflict toward greater intensity and destruction, often far beyond what either side originally intended. We'll examine how this trap ensnares decision-makers, the psychological and strategic factors that feed it, and the devastating consequences when nations find themselves locked in a spiral they can no longer control. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Escalation Trap. Wars rarely unfold as their architects expect. Leaders initiate military campaigns with clear objectives and controlled timelines, confident that overwhelming force will compel adversaries to submit. The opening strikes achieve near-perfect tactical results, but fail to produce political capitulation. At this critical juncture, decision-makers face a choice that determines whether a limited operation remains contained or spirals into something far more dangerous. This moment reveals a pattern that has appeared across modern conflicts, a dynamic where early battlefield success paradoxically pulls nations deeper into wars they cannot easily exit. Political scientist Robert Pape identified this pattern through systematic analysis of air power campaigns and coercion strategies. His research established a three-stage framework that describes how military operations evolve when tactical success fails to produce strategic outcomes. Stage 1 involves tactical success but strategic failure. Strikes hit their targets perfectly while the intended political objective remains distant. Stage 2 features escalation, where leaders double down by intensifying operations under the assumption that more force will succeed where initial efforts fell short. Stage 3 introduces strategic risk through ground force deployments, wider geographic commitments, or targeting decisions that dramatically increase costs and dangers while offering no greater assurance of achieving political objectives. This escalation trap operates through a mechanism Pape termed the progression from escalation dominance to belief in escalation control to widening strategic risk. The stronger power possesses overwhelming military advantages that create confidence it can climb the ladder of violence faster and higher than the opponent. This confidence proves tragically misplaced because it fundamentally misunderstands what drives conflicts. Victory requires changing the political calculations of the adversary's government and population. When bombing itself becomes the primary source of political resistance, escalation produces the opposite of its intended effect. The current war involving the United States, Israel, and Iran displays this pattern with textbook clarity. In late February and early March, American and Israeli forces launched Operation Epic Fury with massive aerial strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, military infrastructure, and leadership compounds. From a strictly military perspective, the campaign demonstrated overwhelming competence and technological superiority. Yet the regime remains intact. Iran continues retaliatory operations and has disrupted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, imposing severe economic costs. The political objective, regime change or fundamental policy reversal, remains as distant as before the war began. This divergence between tactical brilliance and strategic disappointment exemplifies stage 1 of the escalation trap. Precision weapons create an illusion of control over political outcomes. Leaders see overwhelming evidence of their military's effectiveness and conclude they are winning. But they are measuring the wrong thing, counting destroyed targets rather than changed minds, crater fields rather than political transformations. The adversary's government has not shifted its core calculus. Its population has not risen to demand policy change. At this juncture, the trap tightens. Trump administration officials had expected a 4 to 6 week operation at most, making April 1st, day 33 of the war, what one described as a gut check moment. Having already paid significant costs through expended munitions, deployed forces, and placed credibility at stake, leaders face mounting pressure to demonstrate meaningful results. One official characterized growing fears within the administration as buyer's remorse, a recognition that attacking Iran may have been a mistake. Simply stopping the campaign would require acknowledging strategic failure, which becomes politically untenable both internationally and domestically. The decision to launch the war reflected what sources describe as Trump being high on his own supply following quick victories in summer Iran strikes and the operation that abducted Venezuelan President Maduro. These successes created confidence that similar decisive action against Iran would produce rapid regime collapse. One source stated bluntly that Trump grossly overestimated his ability to topple the regime short of sending in ground troops. Yet this overconfidence, combined with pressure from Israel and what Marine Lieutenant Colonel Joe Kent described in his resignation letter as Israel's powerful American lobby, drove decisions that led to epic fury. Kent's resignation became one of the war's early symbolic moments. His letter did not call the operation Epic Fury. Instead, he termed it Epic Mistake, stating that Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation, and it is clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. The resignation crystallized questions about whose interests the war served and whether the strategic logic justifying it could withstand scrutiny. What makes the escalation trap so insidious is that each stage appears to offer a logical path forward while actually narrowing the range of viable options. Leaders begin with controlled strikes designed to achieve limited objectives. When these fail, they escalate to more intensive operations. When those also fall short, they face choices between accepting failure and undertaking commitments that may prove impossible to sustain. At each juncture, the decision to escalate seems more reasonable than acknowledging strategic bankruptcy. Yet each escalation makes the eventual reckoning more painful and the viable paths to resolution more constrained. History shows this pattern across conflicts from Vietnam to Serbia. Air power rarely produces the political transformations its planners expect. The pattern recurs because it flows from structural features of modern warfare. When powerful states rely heavily on precision strikes to achieve political objectives, they create conditions that predictably generate this dynamic. The tactical effectiveness of modern weapons encourages confidence that military force alone can solve political problems. When this confidence proves mistaken, the same military advantages that enabled initial success create pressures for escalation rather than strategic reconsideration. The contrast with alternative frameworks for managing such conflicts proves instructive. Strategist Ellie Lieberman developed a model for escaping escalation traps through what he termed credibility, maneuver, and strategic restraint. President Kennedy's approach during the Cuban Missile Crisis exemplified this framework. He armed to parley, demonstrating military capability while maintaining diplomatic channels and preserving face-saving options for the adversary. The objective involved achieving strategic goals while avoiding escalation dynamics that could spiral beyond control. Operation Epic Fury followed the opposite approach. Rather than calibrating military action to create diplomatic leverage, the administration launched maximum pressure strikes designed to force immediate capitulation. When capitulation failed to materialize, the logic of escalation dominance drove expanded operations. The current deployment of additional Marine forces to the region and discussion of amphibious operations to secure key islands controlling the Strait of Hormuz point toward Stage 3, commitments that are far harder to reverse, more expensive to sustain, and more likely to generate casualties that complicate exit strategies. The framework Pape identified operates independently of particular weapons, specific adversaries, or individual decision-makers. The dynamic emerges from how modern states employ military force to achieve political objectives. When tactical capabilities advance beyond strategic wisdom, when measurement systems optimize for destruction rather than persuasion, when domestic political pressures privilege continued action over strategic reconsideration, these conditions create escalation traps regardless of who sits in the White House or what technologies fill the arsenal. The following chapters examine how each dimension of this escalation trap operates in the current war. The smart bomb trap reveals how technological precision creates false confidence in political outcomes. The historical failure of regime change through air power alone demonstrates why bombing strengthens rather than weakens target governments. Horizontal escalation shows how weaker states widen conflicts geographically to impose costs that superior military power cannot prevent. Economic warfare through energy disruption illustrates the progression from temporary market disruptions to permanent infrastructure damage, creating recession-level shocks. Together, these dynamics explain why a war that began with overwhelming tactical advantages has produced strategic disappointment, and why the logic pushing toward further escalation may prove impossible for leaders to resist. Chapter 2: The Precision Paradox. A bomb launched from an aircraft flying beyond visual range can strike within 3 meters of a designated target 90% of the time. Satellite imagery provides real-time damage assessment showing precisely which structures collapsed and which remain standing. Intelligence networks track individual commanders through electronic signatures, enabling strikes on specific rooms in specific buildings at specific moments. When military commanders brief political leaders on strike packages, they present probabilities approaching certainty. This facility will be destroyed. That commander will be eliminated. These capabilities will be degraded. The briefings display satellite photographs with target boxes, probability calculations showing 90+% success rates, and detailed damage projections. Political leaders see this overwhelming evidence of tactical control and draw the natural but mistaken conclusion that they therefore control the strategic outcome. The current war against Iran demonstrates this trap operating at unprecedented scale and sophistication. American and Israeli forces have conducted what qualifies as the most massive precision air campaign since the 1991 Gulf War. The scale stands in stark contrast to the counterinsurgency operations that dominated American military thinking for 2 decades. This did not happen in the forever wars fought after September 11th in Afghanistan or Iraq, where forces operated against dispersed insurgents rather than conducting sustained strikes against a nation-state's infrastructure. During Desert Storm, coalition aircraft flew roughly 1,500 sorties daily at the campaign's peak, though only a fraction carried precision-guided munitions. The Iran operation has sustained approximately 1,000 sorties per day, with nearly all strikes employing precision weapons. In terms of quantity, the current campaign slightly trails Desert Storm. In terms of technological sophistication and precision-guided munitions density, it represents an entirely different class of operation: industrial-scale precision bombing. President Trump characterized the opening strikes as achieving near-perfect tactical success. His assessment matched the military facts. The Iranian Navy suffered catastrophic losses, with surface vessels destroyed at their moorings. Air defense installations went silent. Command networks disrupted. Senior officials died in their compounds, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself. From a purely tactical perspective, the campaign achieved results that would have seemed fantastical to military planners even 2 decades earlier. Yet Trump's prediction of swift victory proved mistaken. The regime reconstituted quickly under new leadership. Iranian forces continued sophisticated retaliatory operations. Most significantly, Iran demonstrated capacity to impose severe economic costs through disruption of shipping and attacks on energy infrastructure. This divergence between tactical precision and strategic failure reveals the fundamental mechanism of the smart bomb trap. A bomb that lands within 10 feet of its aim point succeeds tactically whether or not it produces any political effect whatsoever. The technology optimizes for accuracy, not for political persuasion. Yet the visual evidence of precision, satellite photos showing collapsed buildings, video footage of missiles striking exact coordinates, creates powerful psychological effects on the attacking side's decision-makers. They see control demonstrated through technological mastery and assume this control extends to political outcomes. The weight of munitions compounds this illusion. Modern precision weapons often employ warheads of 2,000 pounds or more, particularly when targeting hardened structures like underground bunkers or reinforced command centers. The precision guidance ensures the weapon detonates within the target zone, but the blast effects extend far beyond the impact point. A 2,000-pound warhead generates a blast radius of roughly 25 meters. The shock wave extends even further, collapsing structures and shattering windows across wider areas. During the opening nights of the Iran campaign, strikes against leadership compounds in Tehran produced apocalyptic scenes that residents would experience as indistinguishable from area bombing. Buildings collapsed across city blocks. Fires raged through neighborhoods. The explosions generated sufficient heat and chemical reactions to produce acid rain that fell on surrounding areas, causing additional environmental and health effects. To residents experiencing these effects, the technical precision of the weapons proved irrelevant. Whether the bomb landed exactly on target or 50 meters away mattered little when the blast and shock waves devastated everything within range. This gap between tactical precision and ground-level reality creates political effects that work against the attacker's objectives. The bombing does not demonstrate discriminating use of force. Instead, it appears as overwhelming foreign violence against civilian areas, fueling the nationalist mobilization that prevents political capitulation. As detailed in Chapter 3, precision leadership strikes have consistently failed across Libya, Chechnya, Serbia, and Iraq, demonstrating a pattern that extends across different adversaries and technological eras. Leadership elimination also triggers what strategists term the harder successor problem, examined in detail in Chapter 3. Iran's succession to Mujtaba Khamenei illustrated these dynamics, as the new supreme leader assumed power under wartime conditions that incentivized demonstrating strength through confrontation rather than flexibility through negotiation. The measurement problem amplifies every aspect of the smart bomb trap. Military organizations naturally measure what they can count: targets struck, buildings destroyed, equipment eliminated, personnel killed. These metrics dominate briefings because they can be quantified and verified through imagery and intelligence. Political leaders receive detailed accounts of tactical achievements, presented with impressive visual evidence. Satellite photos show before and after comparisons. Video footage captures missiles striking coordinates. Intelligence assessments catalog degraded capabilities. All this data appears to demonstrate success because it measures execution rather than outcome. But the actual objective involves changing political calculations, not maximizing destruction. The goal is compelling an adversary government to alter its policies, or a population to demand their leaders change course. These political transformations cannot be photographed from satellites or quantified in damage assessments. Measuring them requires understanding how bombing affects the target society's internal politics, whether it strengthens or weakens regime legitimacy, whether it mobilizes nationalist resistance or undermines support for continued conflict, whether it creates pressure for accommodation or hardens determination to resist. The tactical metrics that dominate briefings systematically ignore these political dimensions while creating illusions of progress toward objectives that remain unmeasured and often unachieved. President Trump's public statements reveal this measurement confusion clearly. He has described Iran's military as essentially decimated, while noting they have no navy, no anti-aircraft, no air force, everything is gone. These claims accurately reflect tactical destruction while missing the strategic reality. Iran's conventional military capabilities have indeed suffered catastrophic degradation. Yet the regime maintains political control, continues retaliatory operations, and demonstrates capacity to impose severe economic costs through relatively simple means. The disconnect between tactical metrics and strategic outcomes could hardly be starker. American and Israeli forces have achieved near-perfect tactical success, while the fundamental political objective of regime change or capitulation remains as distant as before the war began. This creates the core paradox. The more tactically successful precision strikes become, the more they seduce leaders into believing they control outcomes they cannot actually determine through military force. Previous eras of less accurate weapons at least discouraged illusions of surgical control. Commanders understood that area bombing produced massive destruction with limited precision, making the political consequences more obviously unpredictable. Modern precision weapons eliminate this built-in caution by appearing to offer exact control over exact effects. The technology enables military forces to hit precisely what they aim at, encouraging political leaders to believe they can therefore achieve precisely the political outcomes they desire. The smart bomb trap intensifies when leaders respond to strategic failure by ordering additional precision strikes. The logic appears unassailable. If the first wave weakened the enemy, a second wave should weaken them further until they break. But this assumes a linear relationship between physical destruction and political will. Each additional strike eliminates more infrastructure and personnel, while simultaneously strengthening the political forces that prevent surrender. Iran's response patterns illustrate this dynamic clearly. Despite losing the supreme leader, numerous senior commanders, much of their navy, and significant infrastructure, the regime has not moved toward capitulation. Instead, it has demonstrated adaptive capacity and willingness to impose costs on the attacking coalition through asymmetric means. Iranian forces did not attempt to match American and Israeli air power directly, a contest they would inevitably lose. Rather, they targeted shipping with relatively simple tools like drones and naval mines, attacked energy infrastructure across the Gulf region, and disrupted commercial operations. These responses impose economic and political costs far exceeding the monetary value of the weapons employed. The precision weapon advantage proves largely irrelevant against such asymmetric strategies. American forces can strike Iranian launch sites with extraordinary accuracy, but Iran can simply shift to new locations or disperse launch capabilities across wider areas. Smart bombs excel at destroying fixed infrastructure and known positions. They prove far less effective against mobile threats, dispersed networks, and tactics designed specifically to negate precision targeting advantages. Iran's ability to continue disruptive operations despite suffering overwhelming tactical defeats demonstrates that adversaries have developed strategies specifically to deny stronger powers the political victories that precision weapons promise. How many precision strikes against how many targets would actually compel an adversary government to capitulate when the fundamental political dynamics work against such capitulation? The question exposes the limitation that tactical perfection cannot overcome. If bombing itself strengthens the political forces preventing surrender, then more accurate bombing simply means more effective generation of resistance. The precision weapon advantage proves irrelevant when the weapon's political effects run counter to its intended purpose regardless of where it lands. Understanding why this pattern holds requires examining the historical record of attempts to achieve regime change through air power alone, a record detailed in the following chapter. Chapter 3. The Regime Change Illusion. For over a century, states have attempted to topple foreign governments through air power. The strategy appears logical: destroy the infrastructure that sustains the regime, eliminate its leadership, demonstrate overwhelming force, and the government will collapse or capitulate. Modern precision weapons make this approach seem more viable than ever, allowing attackers to strike with accuracy that earlier generations could not imagine. Yet across this entire span of military history, through the era of unguided bombs dropped from biplanes to the age of satellite-guided missiles striking within meters of their targets, the strategy has never succeeded. Not once has air power alone produced regime change aligned with the attacking power's interests. This is not a matter of insufficient force or inadequate technology. American forces conducted leadership strikes against Libya in 1986 using precision weapons available at that time. The bombs destroyed their targets and killed several Libyan officials, but Colonel Gaddafi remained in power for another 25 years. Russian forces eliminated the Chechen president through targeted strikes in 1996, yet Chechen resistance intensified rather than dissolving. NATO's air campaign against Serbia in 1999 achieved tactical dominance, striking command centers and infrastructure with precision, but Slobodan Milosevic stayed in control and eventually negotiated terms that preserved significant aspects of his domestic political standing. Multiple American administrations authorized strikes against Iraqi leadership throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s. Every operation hit its intended targets. Saddam Hussein remained in power until ground forces invaded in 2003. Understanding why requires examining what happens inside a society when foreign bombs begin falling. Before war starts, many regimes face significant internal opposition. Citizens harbored deep grievances against corruption, economic mismanagement, political repression, or failed policies. Outside observers watching these tensions often assume that once bombing begins, these frustrations will explode into regime-threatening protest. The logic seems straightforward. The government has already lost legitimacy with significant portions of the population, and military attacks will expose the regime's weakness while demonstrating that external powers oppose it. Surely this combination will trigger the internal collapse that the bombs are meant to accelerate. But bombing fundamentally transforms the political question facing the population. Before the attacks, citizens might ask themselves whether they approve of their government's policies, whether the economy functions adequately, whether leaders deserve their positions. These questions create space for opposition and dissent. Once foreign aircraft begin destroying infrastructure and killing citizens, however, the central question changes entirely. The population now faces a different choice. Will they accept political change imposed through foreign military force? This shift proves decisive. Faced with bombs falling on their cities, populations that previously opposed their government often close ranks around it. The regime successfully reframes the conflict from a contest over domestic policies to an existential struggle for national sovereignty against foreign aggression. Opposition figures who criticized the government days earlier face intense pressure to support national unity. Dissent becomes conflated with collaboration with the enemy. Media coverage shifts from questioning government competence to documenting foreign attacks. The bombing itself creates the nationalist cohesion that prevents the political collapse air power is meant to trigger. Historical examples illuminate how this dynamic operates across vastly different societies and conflicts. During the Vietnam War, American bombing campaigns targeted North Vietnam's industrial infrastructure and transportation networks under the assumption that economic destruction would compel Hanoi to negotiate favorable terms. Operation Rolling Thunder and subsequent campaigns dropped more tonnage of bombs on North Vietnam than all Allied forces dropped during the Second World War. The attacks destroyed factories, bridges, rail networks, and port facilities. They disrupted supply lines and imposed severe economic hardship on the civilian population. Entire cities experienced sustained bombing that killed thousands and displaced hundreds of thousands more. Yet the North Vietnamese government not only maintained control, but strengthened its political position throughout this ordeal. The bombing allowed Hanoi to frame the conflict as defense of national sovereignty against foreign imperialism. The narrative resonated powerfully with a population that had already fought colonial powers for independence. Opposition voices within North Vietnam became virtually impossible to sustain publicly when expressing them could be portrayed as supporting an enemy conducting sustained attacks on Vietnamese cities. The Communist Party consolidated authority precisely because foreign bombing provided undeniable evidence of the existential threat the regime claimed to be defending against. Far from breaking North Vietnamese will, the bombing campaigns appeared to harden resolve and deepened nationalist commitment to resistance. The mechanism operates even when the target population initially harbored significant anti-government sentiment. Serbian citizens had numerous grievances against Milosevic's government before NATO began its bombing campaign in 1999. Many opposed his policies in Kosovo and blamed him for Yugoslavia's disintegration and economic decline. Urban populations especially resented the international isolation and economic sanctions that Milosevic's policies had produced. But when NATO bombs began falling on Belgrade and other cities, public opinion shifted dramatically. Milosevic's approval ratings, which had been declining steadily, surged during the bombing. Opposition parties found themselves politically paralyzed. Criticizing the government while it defended against foreign attack appeared treasonous. Rock concerts and public rallies that had previously protested Milosevic's authoritarian rule now rallied around national resistance. The bombing provided Milosevic with nationalist legitimacy he had been losing through domestic policy failures. Iran's current response follows this established pattern despite the unprecedented scale and precision of the attacks against it. The regime faced significant internal opposition before the war. Young people especially resented economic stagnation, social restrictions, and corruption within the clerical establishment. Large protests had erupted in recent years over economic conditions and political freedoms, with demonstrations sometimes escalating into violent confrontations with security forces. Many analysts anticipated that foreign strikes might trigger these frustrations into regime-threatening mobilization, particularly if the strikes successfully eliminated key leadership figures. Instead, the bombing appears to have consolidated the regime's position. Reports from inside Iran describe populations rallying around national defense rather than rising against their government. The foreign threat has marginalized opposition voices and provided the regime with exactly the nationalist legitimacy it was losing through domestic failures. This nationalist mobilization explains why populations fail to overthrow their governments during bombing campaigns. But it does not fully explain why leadership elimination strikes, which do successfully kill key officials, also fail to produce regime change. When precision weapons remove the leader who consolidated power and commands the state apparatus, why does the regime not collapse into factional infighting or capitulate to foreign pressure? The answer involves what can be termed the harder successor problem. When bombing kills a regime's leader, the succession occurs under wartime conditions with the foreign threat still active and immediate. This context creates powerful incentives for successors to demonstrate resolve and strength rather than seek accommodation with the attacking power. A new leader assuming authority during active foreign bombing faces immediate questions about their legitimacy and capacity to defend the nation. The quickest path to consolidating power often involves proving toughness through continued resistance rather than appearing weak through negotiation. The successor's incentive structure differs fundamentally from that of the leader who was killed. The predecessor built their authority over years or decades, establishing networks of support and accumulating political capital that provided flexibility in decision-making. The successor inherits authority suddenly, often facing rivals within the elite who question their legitimacy. Under these circumstances, appearing to capitulate to foreign demands becomes politically suicidal. Even if the successor privately judges that accommodation might serve the nation's interests, the domestic political imperative demands demonstrating that they will defend national sovereignty as forcefully as their predecessor. Russia's experience in Chechnya demonstrated this dynamic with particular clarity. When Russian forces killed the Chechen president in 1996 through precision strikes, Moscow anticipated that the loss of established leadership would fragment the resistance. Instead, succession immediately fell to younger, more radical figures with stronger incentives to prove themselves through confrontation. These successors lacked the political capital of the eliminated leader, but compensated through aggressive military action that intensified the conflict. Rather than producing a more compliant leadership, the decapitation strike resulted in harder-line successors who escalated resistance to consolidate their own positions. Serbia's succession patterns during the Kosovo conflict followed similar logic. NATO strikes targeted command facilities and leadership compounds, eliminating various officials in Milosevic's circle. Yet each elimination strengthened rather than weakened the regime's resolve. Replacements came from security services and military networks, with even stronger incentives for confrontation. The casualties did not create space for accommodationist voices to emerge. They elevated figures whose authority derived specifically from their willingness to resist foreign pressure. Iran's leadership transition following Ali Khamenei's assassination exemplifies the harder successor problem operating at scale in the current war. The supreme leader's death in the opening American and Israeli strikes removed the figure who had consolidated religious and political authority over decades. Many observers anticipated that his elimination would trigger factional struggles within the clerical establishment that might fracture the regime. Instead, succession moved swiftly to his son Mojtaba Khamenei under circumstances that would have seemed politically impossible before the war. Mojtaba Khamenei lacks the religious credentials traditionally required for the position of supreme leader. His father was a senior cleric with decades of religious scholarship and teaching. Mojtaba's religious training, while substantial by ordinary standards, does not match the scholarly authority expected of Iran's highest religious office. Under normal circumstances, senior clerics would likely have contested his elevation, arguing for candidates with stronger religious qualifications. But the wartime succession occurred under abnormal circumstances where different qualifications mattered more than religious scholarship. Mojtaba's actual power base rests not with the religious establishment, but with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and internal security networks. He spent years building relationships with IRGC commanders and intelligence officials. When succession occurred during active foreign bombing, these security connections proved more valuable than religious credentials. The IRGC needed a leader who would authorize continued resistance and maintain support for their operations. Mojtaba provided that leadership precisely because his authority derived from security networks rather than clerical circles that might favor accommodation. This succession structure creates incentives directly opposite to what attacking powers hope leadership elimination will produce. Rather than installing more flexible leadership open to negotiation, the strike elevated a figure whose domestic political survival depends on proving strength through confrontation. Mojtaba cannot afford to appear weak when his authority rests primarily on coercive institutions rather than religious legitimacy. Demonstrating resolve becomes the mechanism through which he consolidates power against potential rivals who might question his religious qualifications. The succession also weakened one of the few ideological constraints that previously shaped Iran's strategic doctrine. Ali Khamenei maintained for years that nuclear weapons violated Islamic law, issuing what was often described as a nuclear fatwa, declaring such weapons incompatible with religious principles. Whether this represented genuine theological conviction or strategic cover for avoiding crossing red lines, it created at least nominal doctrinal limits on Iran's nuclear program. The ruling tied nuclear restraint directly to the supreme leader's personal religious authority. Mojtaba Khamenei lacks equivalent religious standing to issue such rulings. What was framed as theological doctrine under his father becomes merely strategic policy under his leadership, something potentially subject to revision based on wartime calculations rather than fixed religious principle. If the previous supreme leader's religious authority was the primary barrier preventing Iran from weaponizing its nuclear program, that barrier has now weakened considerably. The leadership decapitation strike may have removed the one figure whose ideological position constrained Iran's most dangerous strategic option. Why then do attacking powers persist in pursuing regime change through air power alone when the strategy has never succeeded? The answer involves the seductive combination of military capability and political wishful thinking. Modern militaries can demonstrate overwhelming tactical competence through precision strikes. Intelligence services can track enemy leaders and predict their locations. Satellite imagery provides seemingly irrefutable evidence of destroyed targets and degraded capabilities. These capabilities create confidence that eliminating the right targets will produce political transformation. The technology makes the political outcome appear inevitable. Surely a government that has lost its military infrastructure, its leadership, and its capacity to defend itself must collapse or capitulate. But this assumption rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of what drives political outcomes in target societies. The persistent failure of this approach across a century of attempts has not eliminated the temptation to believe that this time, with these weapons, against this adversary, the strategy will finally work. Each new technological advancement, from guided bombs in the 1980s to satellite-directed munitions today, revives confidence that precision has finally reached the threshold where tactical success automatically produces strategic victory. The trap operates precisely because tactical perfection does not automatically lead to strategic success. Overconfidence that it does blinds decision-makers to the political mechanisms that determine whether bombing produces capitulation or resistance. When leaders see overwhelming evidence of their military's effectiveness in briefings filled with satellite photos and damage assessments, they naturally conclude they are winning. But they are measuring the wrong thing, counting destroyed targets rather than changed minds, crater fields rather than political transformations. Understanding these dynamics raises fundamental questions about alternative approaches that might address the political problem that military force cannot solve. If bombing strengthens the very regimes it aims to topple, and if eliminating leaders only elevates harder successors, what strategic logic could possibly justify continued reliance on air power to achieve political objectives that history demonstrates it cannot deliver? Chapter 4. Widening the War. When states confront adversaries who possess overwhelming military advantages, attempting direct confrontation guarantees defeat. Iranian forces could never match American and Israeli air power in sustained combat over Iranian territory. The opening weeks of the war demonstrated this reality conclusively, as precision strikes devastated Iran's navy, eliminated air defenses, and destroyed military infrastructure with near impunity. Yet this tactical dominance has not translated into strategic victory, precisely because Iran chose not to fight the war its opponents designed. Instead of attempting to defend fixed positions against attacks it cannot repel, Iran widened the conflict geographically and politically to impose costs in domains where its opponents hold no comparable advantages. This approach reflects a strategic concept turned horizontal escalation, expanding the scope of conflict across new geographic areas and political arenas rather than intensifying operations in a single theater. For weaker parties in military confrontations, the strategy offers a pathway to relevance that direct military competition would deny. Rather than trying to defeat superior forces on the battlefield they dominate, horizontal escalation multiplies the arenas of risk and forces the stronger power to defend across a vastly expanded perimeter. The weaker side does not need to win any particular engagement. It merely needs to impose sufficient costs across enough domains that the political coalition supporting the war begins questioning whether continued operations serve their interests. Iran's implementation became visible within days of the initial strikes. Rather than concentrating defensive efforts on protecting military assets or attempting futile retaliation against well-defended Israeli and American positions, Iranian forces turned their attention to targets possessing three crucial characteristics. First, they were vulnerable to relatively simple weapons like drones and missiles that Iran could produce or acquire cheaply and in substantial numbers. Second, their disruption imposed economic and political costs far exceeding the monetary value of the weapons used against them. Third, and most importantly, they belonged to or served nations other than the United States and Israel, nations that had not chosen this war and possessed limited enthusiasm for absorbing its costs. The Strait of Hormuz emerged as the central arena where these characteristics converged. This narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea carries roughly 20% of the world's oil supply and similar proportions of liquefied natural gas. Iran did not need to close the strait completely to achieve strategic effects. Simply making passage uncertain sufficed. A drone strike near a tanker off Fujairah. Naval mines reportedly discovered drifting in shipping lanes. Missile explosions near loading terminals. Each incident rippled through insurance markets and shipping schedules. Tanker companies began rerouting vessels or delaying departures pending clearer security assessments. Insurance underwriters raised premiums or withdrew coverage entirely for Gulf transits. But Iran's horizontal expansion extended far beyond making the strait dangerous. The strategic logic demanded targeting the broader coalition's economic infrastructure to create political pressures that direct military strikes against American and Israeli forces could never generate. On the evening of March 8th, the same night Israel struck the South Pars gas field, Iranian forces launched retaliatory operations across the Gulf region with precision that suggested careful advance planning rather than hasty response. Missiles struck Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city, one of the world's largest liquefied natural gas facilities. The complex encompasses refineries, storage tanks, and export terminals that process substantial portions of global LNG supply. Qatar Energy reported the attacks caused sizable fires and extensive damage. Subsequent assessments indicated the strikes knocked out approximately 17% of Qatar's LNG export capacity. The company's chief executive stated that repairs could require up to 5 years, and the damage might force invoking force majeure clauses in long-term supply contracts with European and Asian buyers. Such declarations would void the contracts without penalty, but would also signal to global markets that reliable supply from the Gulf could no longer be assumed. The same night, Iranian missiles hit the Samref refinery on Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast, Al Hassan gas field facilities in the United Arab Emirates, and multiple Kuwaiti oil refineries. These were not scattered targets chosen opportunistically. They represented key nodes in the Gulf energy infrastructure that supplies markets across Asia and Europe. The strikes demonstrated Iran's capacity to threaten the energy security of nations that had provided varying degrees of support to American operations, hosting bases, offering diplomatic cover, or simply maintaining trade relationships with Washington despite the conflict. Prince Sultan Air Base near Riyadh suffered particularly significant damage when Iranian missiles struck fuel storage tanks at the facility. American forces had been using this base to launch strikes against Iran. The attack destroyed critical infrastructure while sending an unmistakable message to Saudi leadership. Hosting American military operations would result in direct damage to Saudi economic assets. The strikes forced an impossible choice: continue supporting American operations and risk further attacks on infrastructure vital to the Saudi economy, or distance themselves from Washington and face potential American displeasure. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who assumed power after his father's death in the opening American strikes, articulated the strategic objective explicitly. In a statement on March 12th, he declared that neighboring countries must clarify their position with the aggressors and close American bases as soon as possible. The message could hardly have been clearer. Iran intended to make the cost of hosting American forces prohibitively high by targeting the economic assets those countries depended upon. The strategy sought to create wedges not just between the United States and Gulf governments, but between those governments and their own populations who would bear the economic consequences of infrastructure damage. This political dimension amplified the economic effects. Gulf monarchies have long feared the kind of popular uprising that toppled the Shah of Iran in 1979 and ushered in the Islamic Republic. Their legitimacy rests partly on delivering economic prosperity and stability to populations that might otherwise question authoritarian governance. When Iranian strikes set ablaze the refineries and gas facilities that fund government budgets and provide employment, they create pressure from below. Citizens begin asking why their countries are paying the price for conflicts they did not choose. Why should Qatari gas workers lose their livelihoods because of decisions made in Washington? Why should Kuwaiti families endure fuel shortages because their government hosts American bases? Iranian strategy deliberately exploited these fault lines. The attacks were designed to create wedges between the United States and Gulf states by forcing Gulf regimes to confront the gap between their governmental alignment with Washington and their population's interests in avoiding economic devastation. Even autocracies must maintain some minimal level of public acquiescence. When that erodes, regimes face pressure to adjust their foreign alignments or risk domestic instability. Qatar's response illustrated the political bind Iran's strategy created. After the Ras Laffan strikes, Qatari officials expelled Iranian diplomats in protest. But they also expressed fury with both the United States and Israel. A senior official close to Qatar's leadership described the country as livid that a war partly justified as necessary to protect international oil and gas flows had now set Qatar's vital infrastructure ablaze. The Gulf Kingdom found itself angry at Iran for launching the attacks, but equally angry at American and Israeli decisions that triggered the retaliation. Qatar had not chosen this war. It hosted major American military facilities and maintained complex diplomatic relationships with Washington. Now it was absorbing devastating economic damage because of decisions made elsewhere. French President Emmanuel Macron termed the escalation around the South Pars gas field reckless. Together with leaders from the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan, he called for an immediate comprehensive moratorium on attacks against civilian infrastructure, including oil and gas installations. Notably absent from this joint statement was any expression of support for American war objectives or condemnation focused solely on Iran. The message instead treated both sides' attacks on energy infrastructure as equivalently dangerous to global stability. This diplomatic positioning revealed how horizontal escalation achieves political effects that direct military confrontation cannot. Iran's strikes on Gulf infrastructure did not threaten American or Israeli military capabilities. They did not shoot down additional aircraft or destroy American bases. But they created a situation where America's European allies publicly called for restraint from Washington while offering only vague support for securing the Strait of Hormuz. The war that began as American and Israeli strikes against Iran had evolved into a conflict where those initiating powers faced increasing diplomatic isolation as their own allies questioned the wisdom of operations that destabilized global energy markets. The cost asymmetry underlying Iran's approach deserves particular emphasis because it explains why horizontal escalation remains sustainable even after suffering devastating military losses. Iran attacks shipping and infrastructure using weapons that cost a tiny fraction of the defenses required to stop them. A Shahed 136 drone, which Iran produces domestically, carries a reported unit cost around $10,000. These drones have successfully struck billion-dollar facilities and forced responses from air defense systems whose missiles cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars each. An Iranian naval mine might cost a few $1,000s to produce and deploy, but requires expensive minesweeping operations to clear and makes entire shipping lanes too risky for tankers worth hundreds of millions. One defense analyst calculated that Gulf states now spend approximately $28 on defense for every dollar Iran invests in its offensive arsenal. This ratio explains why Iran can sustain horizontal escalation essentially indefinitely. Even after losing most of its navy and air defenses, it retains capacity to produce simple weapons that threaten complex, expensive, and difficult-to-defend targets. Geography reinforces every aspect of Iran's advantages in this contest. The Strait of Hormuz spans barely 21 miles at its narrowest point, with shipping lanes passing within easy range of Iranian coastal positions. The country's southern coastline extends for hundreds of miles along the Gulf, offering countless potential launch sites for drones and small boats. American and allied naval forces can patrol the strait and shoot down threats they detect, but they cannot eliminate the persistent capacity to generate new threats from dispersed positions along the coast. Strike Iranian launch sites today, and tomorrow they operate from different locations. Destroy Iranian small boats, and they deploy more from hidden coastal facilities. The problem persists because geography grants the defender permanent advantages that the attacker's military superiority cannot eliminate. President Trump's public frustration with this dynamic became increasingly evident during the second week of March. He demanded that NATO allies help reopen the strait, describing countries like China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom as affected by what he termed Iran's artificial constraint. He indicated American forces would bomb the hell out of the shoreline and shoot Iranian boats out of the water. Yet these threats could not overcome the fundamental geographic reality that Iran could continue threatening shipping from positions that conventional bombing cannot permanently neutralize. This geography-based resilience helps explain why Iran's foreign minister rejected American attempts to restart negotiations. Abbas Araghchi, who had engaged in extensive diplomatic discussions with American envoys before the war, refused to respond to messages from the White House after the strikes began. His explanation was straightforward. American negotiators could not be trusted given their decision to launch attacks after diplomatic engagement appeared to be making progress. From Iran's perspective, demonstrated willingness to attack after promising diplomacy destroyed credibility for future negotiations. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps reinforced this defiance with stark messaging. In response to American statements about determining the war's end conditions, the IRGC declared, "We are the ones who will determine the end of the war." This was not empty rhetoric. Iran's capacity to sustain disruption of strait shipping and threaten Gulf infrastructure meant it genuinely possessed the power to ensure the conflict continued regardless of American preferences. Washington could not unilaterally end the war by stopping its own strikes, because Iran could continue its horizontal escalation indefinitely.
Historical precedents illuminate this dynamic. During the Second Boer War, Boer forces facing overwhelming British military superiority adopted tactics that widened the conflict's geographic scope and imposed economic costs far exceeding any military advantage Britain held. Unable to defeat British forces in direct engagement, the Boers destroyed farms, infrastructure, and supply networks across vast areas, forcing Britain to disperse forces widely and invest enormous resources protecting lines of communication and supply. Similarly, Iraq's decision to set fire to hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells during the 1991 Gulf War reflected the same logic: impose lasting economic and environmental damage that extends well beyond any battlefield outcome. When survival appears at stake, imposing long-term costs on the adversary becomes rational, even if it offers no immediate military advantage. Iran's horizontal escalation operates from identical strategic logic, but with mechanisms that extend further. The strategy succeeds not by winning battles, but by raising the price of continued conflict until political support erodes among those bearing the costs. The stronger power discovers that its military advantages grant control over some dimensions of the conflict, but not others, and the dimensions Iran controls include whether America's coalition partners continue supporting operations that devastate their economic interests.
Chapter 5. The Permanent Toll. Not all escalation imposes the same kind of cost. Some military actions create temporary disruptions that reverse quickly once the immediate threat recedes. Tankers delay departures until security improves. Insurance premiums spike, then gradually decline. Supply flows slow, but resume within days or weeks. These disruptions create market volatility and raise prices temporarily, but they do not fundamentally alter the physical infrastructure through which energy reaches global markets. The damage is economic and psychological rather than structural. It creates the illusion that the conflict can be paused and unwound, that normal operations will resume once the shooting stops. But the war involving the United States, Israel, and Iran appears to be crossing a threshold into something fundamentally different. The shift is not merely a matter of degree, more strikes, higher oil prices, greater market anxiety. It represents a transformation in the nature of harm being inflicted. The conflict is moving from disruption, which can be reversed, to damage, which cannot. This distinction carries profound implications because damage removes physical capacity from global energy markets for prolonged periods measured in months or years rather than days or weeks. And months represent exactly the time horizon economists associate with recession-level shocks to the global economy. Understanding this threshold requires distinguishing between two categories of harm that often get conflated in discussions of energy security. Disruption occurs when the flow of oil or gas slows or becomes uncertain without destroying the physical infrastructure that moves it. Threats to shipping lanes force tankers to reroute or delay passage, raising costs and creating supply uncertainty. Insurance companies increase premiums or withdraw coverage. Shipping companies hesitate before sending vessels through contested waters. These effects are real and economically significant. Oil prices spiked past $100 per barrel within 2 weeks of the war's start, with some projections suggesting they could reach $180 if disruptions continued. But these disruption effects remain fundamentally reversible. Once the immediate threat declines, if attacks reduce or if naval forces succeed in securing shipping lanes, the flows can resume relatively quickly. Tankers that delayed departure can proceed. Insurance companies reassess risk and potentially reduce premiums. The infrastructure itself remains intact. Storage facilities, loading terminals, pipelines, and refineries continue functioning or can restart operations within short time frames. Disruption creates economic pain through uncertainty and delay, but it does not permanently remove supply from global markets.
Damage operates through an entirely different mechanism. It destroys the physical infrastructure required to produce, process, store, and transport energy. When missiles strike export terminals, they are not merely delaying shipments. They are destroying complex systems of pipelines, storage tanks, and loading facilities that took years to construct and cannot be rapidly replaced. Iran's oil infrastructure depends heavily on Karg Island, which handles approximately 90% of the country's crude oil exports. The island hosts integrated systems where oil from mainland fields arrives via submarine pipeline, flows into massive storage tanks, then moves to offshore loading terminals where tankers receive it for export. These are not simple facilities that can be rebuilt quickly with off-the-shelf components. The storage tanks alone represent engineering projects requiring specialized construction. The loading terminals extend offshore as complex structures designed to accommodate very large crude carriers. The pipeline systems incorporate pumping stations, valve networks, and monitoring equipment calibrated to move specific grades of crude at precise rates. Significant damage to any component of this integrated system can halt exports entirely. Partial damage reduces capacity and creates operational complications that persist for months during repairs.
This distinction between disruption and damage becomes decisive when considering economic consequences. Short-term disruptions create price volatility, but economies can absorb them through various mechanisms: releasing strategic petroleum reserves, increasing production at other facilities, reducing demand through higher prices. The administration has discussed massive releases from strategic petroleum reserves as one temporary measure to ease market pressure. These tools help cushion the immediate shock, but they cannot compensate for sustained removal of significant supply capacity. When millions of barrels per day of oil production or substantial percentages of global LNG capacity disappear from markets for months, the economic effects transcend temporary volatility and enter the territory of sustained recessionary pressure. The economic reasoning is straightforward. Modern economies depend on reliable energy supplies at predictable prices. Transportation costs determine whether goods can profitably move between markets. Manufacturing requires energy inputs at costs that allow competitive pricing. Households allocate budgets based on expected fuel and electricity expenses. When energy prices rise sharply and remain elevated for months, these calculations break down across the entire economic system. Transportation companies cannot pass all fuel cost increases to customers without reducing demand. Manufacturers face margin compression that force production cuts or layoffs. Households reduce spending on other goods to cover higher energy bills, decreasing demand across retail sectors. These individual responses aggregate into recession. GDP growth slows as higher energy costs ripple through supply chains. Inflation accelerates as energy price increases feed into costs for virtually all goods and services. Central banks face impossible trade-offs. Raise interest rates to combat inflation and risk deepening the recession, or maintain lower rates and accept sustained inflation that erodes purchasing power. The 2008 global financial crisis included an oil price spike to $147 per barrel that preceded the economic collapse. Current projections of prices potentially reaching $180 place the global economy in territory associated with severe recessions. Some analysts expect the crisis could continue until September, adding urgency to these economic pressures. But price levels alone do not determine whether markets face disruption or damage. The crucial variable is duration. A temporary spike to even very high prices, if it clearly will reverse within weeks, allows economic actors to adjust through short-term measures, drawing down inventories, deferring non-essential travel, delaying production runs. Markets can absorb these adjustments without fundamental dislocations. But when participants believe high prices will persist for months because physical supply capacity has been permanently reduced, they make different decisions. Companies lock in long-term contracts at elevated prices. Airlines hedge fuel costs at levels that guarantee sustained increases in ticket prices. Shipping companies build higher fuel costs into rates that persist even after spot prices eventually decline.
Iranian attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure have begun moving the conflict from the disruption category into damage territory. Refineries across Gulf states sustained missile strikes that physically destroyed processing capacity, requiring extended periods to rebuild. These facilities represent critical nodes in the infrastructure that delivers energy to Asian and European markets. Their damage does not merely delay shipments, it removes processing and export capacity from the global system for months or years. The distinction matters because it determines whether Iran can continue imposing economic costs even if direct military operations achieve diminishing returns. Damaged infrastructure remains damaged regardless of battlefield outcomes. Even if every Iranian launch site were destroyed and every drone shot down, the destroyed export terminals would not magically repair themselves. The refinery capacity knocked offline would not resume production. The physical removal of supply capacity persists independently of which side is winning militarily at any given moment. This creates an asymmetry that fundamentally favors Iran's strategic position despite its overwhelming military disadvantages. Iran recognizes this asymmetry and possesses powerful incentives to exploit it through infrastructure targeting. For Tehran, the stakes are existential rather than merely strategic. The regime faces a threat to its survival from the most powerful military coalition ever assembled against it. Under these circumstances, the rational calculation shifts dramatically. When existence itself is at risk, imposing deep and prolonged costs on the adversary becomes more valuable than preserving capacity to benefit from future economic cooperation that may never materialize.
This logic has appeared in previous conflicts where one side faced existential threats. During the Second Boer War, Boer forces confronting overwhelming British military superiority destroyed their own farms and infrastructure to deny resources to advancing British forces. The scorched earth tactics imposed no immediate military advantage, but created long-term economic costs on the region and on Britain's capacity to sustain occupation. The destruction removed productive capacity from operation for years, forcing Britain to invest enormous resources in reconstruction, while achieving none of its political objectives through military force alone. The Boers could not defeat British armies in direct combat, but they could ensure that victory came at a price that eventually undermined British political will to continue the war. When Iraqi forces set fire to hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells during their retreat in 1991, the act followed identical logic. The fires did not improve Iraq's battlefield position, which had already collapsed. They imposed lasting economic and environmental damage that removed significant oil production from global markets for months while specialized teams worked to extinguish the blazes. The wells produced nothing but atmospheric pollution during this period. Saddam Hussein's regime faced existential threat from the coalition arrayed against it, and responded by destroying value in ways that imposed costs the adversary could not easily absorb. The infrastructure damage persisted long after military operations ceased, demonstrating how permanent destruction creates effects independent of battlefield outcomes. These historical examples demonstrate that when survival appears at stake, destroying value becomes rational if it imposes costs the adversary cannot easily absorb. Iran today faces circumstances more existential than Iraq did during the Gulf War. The explicit American and Israeli objective involves regime change. Under such threat, why would Iran's leadership prioritize preserving infrastructure that serves global markets which have supported sanctions against it for decades? The rational choice involves imposing maximum pain on those markets to create political pressure for ending the war, even if that pain comes through permanent infrastructure damage rather than temporary disruption. The economic warfare framework helps clarify this strategic logic. Economic warfare unfolds in 3 stages, each involving different mechanisms and timescales. Stage 1 centers on disruption, interfering with trade, resources, or finance in ways that create uncertainty without necessarily destroying physical capacity. Markets react to this uncertainty through higher prices and reduced flows. Iran achieved this stage within days of the war's start. Stage 2 involves economic shock, where disruptions persist long enough and intensely enough that price rises and supply chain tightening create broader economic stress. Inflation spreads across economies, growth slows. The localized disruption becomes a general economic problem affecting populations far removed from the immediate conflict zone. Current oil price levels and the global inflationary pressures they generate suggest the conflict has entered this second stage.
Stage 3 emerges when economic stress continues until it produces political consequences. Governments face inflation, slowing growth, and domestic dissatisfaction. Alliances weaken as members question whether their interests align with continuing the conflict. Leaders come under pressure to change policy. The objective is not immediate collapse, but cumulative pressure that eventually forces political change, especially when one side demands measured policy adjustments, like neutrality in an ongoing dispute, rather than unconditional surrender. The 1973 oil shock provides the closest historical parallel for understanding how this Stage 3 dynamic might unfold. Following the outbreak of the Arab-Israeli War that October, Arab oil producers cut output and halted exports to Western countries supporting Israel. The crisis began with disruption as producers reduced supply. Markets reacted immediately, with prices quadrupling from roughly $3 per barrel to nearly $12. This marked the transition to economic shock. The consequences rippled across Western economies. Gasoline shortages produced long lines at filling stations. Governments imposed fuel rationing and reduced highway speed limits to conserve supply. Inflation surged while growth slowed, producing the phenomenon labeled stagflation. By the mid-1970s, the crisis had reached Stage 3, political pressure. Western economies endured recession, unemployment rose, and governments faced intense domestic criticism over energy policy. The shock reshaped energy strategy across the industrial world and altered Western diplomacy in the Middle East. But the current war presents a crucial difference from the 1973 crisis. Arab producers then achieved disruption through coordinated production cuts. They reduced supply but did not destroy infrastructure. When political conditions shifted, they could restore production relatively quickly. The supply reduction was a policy choice, reversible through policy adjustment. Today's conflict involves actual infrastructure destruction that cannot be rapidly reversed. This represents permanent removal of capacity from global markets until extensive reconstruction occurs. Similarly, the '73 crisis emerged from coordinated state action by producers who controlled their own resources. The current damage results from military strikes, destroying facilities that cannot be replaced quickly, regardless of diplomatic settlements. This permanence transforms the economic calculus for all parties. Markets cannot treat the supply reduction as temporary and wait for resolution. They must price in the reality that this capacity will remain offline for years, regardless of battlefield outcomes. Energy analysts noted that even if the conflict ended tomorrow, oil prices would not return to pre-war levels of $67 per barrel. The damage to energy infrastructure is done and will take months, if not years, to repair the more extensively damaged facilities. Moreover, from this point forward, energy markets will factor future potential disruption into the baseline price of oil. The risk premium becomes permanent. This permanent pricing shift creates sustained economic pressure far beyond what temporary disruptions generate. When households and businesses face durably higher energy costs, they adjust consumption patterns in ways that reduce economic activity. Transportation companies permanently restructure operations around higher fuel costs. Manufacturing relocates production to reduce energy intensity or transport distances. These adjustments represent real economic losses, reduced output, lost jobs, diminished productivity, that accumulate over months and years. The global recession risks emerging from this dynamic are not hypothetical constructs from economic models. They reflect observable market responses to sustained energy price shocks. Every major global recession in recent decades has featured energy price spikes as either a cause or significant contributing factor. The current trajectory places oil prices in territory associated with severe economic downturns, while the underlying supply infrastructure continues suffering damage that ensures prolonged elevated prices. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's statement that the administration was considering easing sanctions on Iranian oil currently held at sea reveals the desperation of trying to manage supply through short-term measures while infrastructure damage creates long-term problems. The proposal involves releasing Iranian oil that was seized or embargoed to increase immediate supply and pressure prices downward. But this addresses disruption, not damage. Once those existing stockpiles are released and consumed, the supply increase vanishes. It does nothing to restore the processing and export capacity that missile strikes have removed from operation. The fundamental problem is that one side in this conflict can continue imposing damage indefinitely while the other side lacks comparable tools to reverse it. Iran can launch missiles at refineries and export terminals as long as it possesses missiles and launchers. Even if many strikes are intercepted, some will succeed. Each successful strike against complex infrastructure imposes damage that takes months or years to repair. American and Israeli forces can destroy Iranian launch sites, but Iran can relocate or conceal launchers. They can eliminate Iranian military infrastructure, but that does not rebuild damaged facilities across the Gulf. The time dimension creates the ultimate asymmetry. Military strikes achieve their effects within hours. A missile hits its target, the explosion destroys the facility, damage is immediate and total. Infrastructure reconstruction requires months or years. Engineering teams must assess damage, design repairs, procure specialized equipment, execute construction, and test systems before restoration. During this entire period, the capacity remains offline. 1 hour of successful missile strikes can remove infrastructure from operation for 1 year or longer. This ratio ensures that even limited Iranian success in reaching targets produces disproportionate long-term effects. Markets have begun pricing this asymmetry into their baseline assumptions.
The risk is no longer theoretical. Facilities have been destroyed, capacity has been removed, and the repair timeline stretches toward September at minimum for some damaged infrastructure, with the most severely damaged facilities facing years of reconstruction. Each week that passes with oil prices elevated and supply capacity offline moves the global economy closer to recession territory. How long political coalitions sustain these mounting costs remains the decisive question. Not which military achieves tactical superiority, but which society's political structures fracture first under economic pressure that shows no sign of abating.
The escalation trap reveals a fundamental paradox. Precision weapons create an illusion of political control that military force cannot deliver. Air power strengthens regimes through nationalist mobilization rather than toppling them. Horizontal escalation allows weaker adversaries to impose costs the stronger power cannot prevent. And the shift from temporary disruption to permanent infrastructure damage creates sustained economic pressure that military superiority cannot reverse. This pattern recurs because it flows from structural features of modern warfare. When tactical capabilities exceed strategic wisdom, when measurement systems optimize for destruction rather than persuasion, when political pressures privileged continued action over strategic reconsideration, these conditions create traps regardless of specific technologies, adversaries, or leaders. The decisive question is never which military wins battles, but which society's political cohesion fractures first under mounting costs. Thank you for listening.